Hi, my name is Dan Ullmer, and I'm the Chief Engineer at Blue Ridge PBS. I have always enjoyed riding bicycles, but when I moved to the Roanoke area 6 years ago, I found bicycling to be much more difficult due to the hilly terrain, so I pretty much gave up on it. After a motorcycle mishap that broke my ankle, I knew it was time to quit that hobby and figure out a way to enjoy bicycling again. The answer for me was the electric bicycle, or e-bike. I began reading all about them and soon built my own bike using a kit I purchased on the internet. Once I got the bug, there was no turning back, and I've now built several e-bikes and have ridden over 2,000 miles on them. I'm not an expert, but I've gained a lot of practical knowledge that I would like to share with you. It will cover the basics so you can decide if e-bikes are right for you. Furthermore, this is what a typical rider would need to consider purchasing or buying one. I will break down the various topics into short modules to make it easier for you to follow. So let's get started. So, what is an e-bike and why are they so useful? Well, an e-bike is a regular bicycle, but it has an electric motor. The electric motor and battery are going to augment your energy and make it easier to bike. So if you're tired or you're climbing a lot of hills, the e-bike's going to give you the additional power and energy to climb them, and to climb them without stressing yourself. And that's going to make it a lot more fun. It's also going to extend your range. With more range, you can go more places. And if it's a hot day, you can use the extra electric power so you don't have to pedal so hard and you don't have to get as hot. And I'll tell you another thing, when you're on a bicycle, you've got the wind to cool you off. It is more comfortable and cooler riding on a bicycle than it is walking. Certainly more than running. And you can get just as much exercise as you need. You can scale it for whatever you need by how much assist you use from the electric motor. You don't have to use any assist if you don't want to, or you can use lots of assist if it's at the end of the day and you're getting really tired, or if you pull a muscle or hurt your leg, you have that going for you. So it's very good exercise. It's exercise that you have the ability to adjust regardless of where you're going and to some extent how far you're going. I find that with an electric assist bike, I can cruise 30 miles in a day comfortably. That means I can go over to the New River Trail at DRAPER and bike for 15 miles out along those trails, enjoying myself, have a nice picnic, bike back, and I can do that in 3 hours and never break a sweat. That makes it a lot of fun. The Jackson River Trail is another trail that's wonderful to ride. It's 28 miles long. With an e-bike, I can do the whole trail with no problem. My wife and I have done it many times. Wonderful, wonderful riding there. Without the e-bike, I don't think we'd do the whole trail. We might do half of it, and we'd be tuckered out after that. So that's another big advantage. I find that e-bikes are actually a little safer. A person might think safer, they go faster. Not necessarily. They only go faster if you want them to go faster. But because you have the electric assist, there's no hesitation to stop at a stop sign or to slow down when you approach pedestrians. Because you know you can get up to speed real easy again. You don't have to try to save that energy so that you don't have to pedal hard again to get back up. You just turn the throttle or adjust the assist up a little bit and you're back up to speed in no time. So there's all these positive attributes. You know, in Europe, they've really caught on in Europe. They, up to 50% of the bikes sold in some countries in Europe are e-bikes now. We're still around maybe 3 or 4% here in the US. It still hasn't caught on completely, but it will because it's such a good idea. And if you ever dreamed of having an electric car and can't afford it, well, the e-bike is a two-wheel version in a way. That's another way to get introduced to electric vehicles without the big price tag. So that is what makes e-bike special, and that's probably why you're watching this, and we have more to tell you. In this module, we're going to cover the 3 types of e-bikes that you may consider for purchasing. I'm going to go over each one and cover what makes them different. This is what I consider the urban bike. The urban bike has a couple things that make it a little different than the others. For one thing, the tires are going to be a little narrower, and the tires are going to have a little finer tread on them. Now, this bike in particular is a 40-year-old bike, and it was considered a hybrid back in the day. But it's still relevant and still a well-made bike that made a good conversion for an e-bike. So the narrow tires are good for on pavement and light gravel. It doesn't have any particular suspension, although there is suspension in these forks, believe it or not. And we've added suspension on the seat, so it's fairly comfortable, and it does a fairly good job around town. I actually enjoy riding this bike all over Salem and Roanoke on the side streets and on the trails, and it works quite well. Another thing I can mention is that these are 700cc tires. Of course, you're probably used to hearing 24-inch or 26-inch tires. 700cc is a little larger and so a little smoother, a little better for riding over bumps and going across potholes and so on. Although you generally want to avoid that if you can. This is a modern e-bike that you can buy in the store today. This is a factory model. This is geared a little more towards town and trail like the other bike, but they have some nice enhancements that make it a little better than the previous bike. For one, and it's a major difference, the tires are wider. And they've got the nice smooth tread in the middle for on the road, but they got the little knobbies on the side which help more in the gravel. And because the tire is wider, it rides a little better over the gravel. So this bike does a little better job on pea gravel and going over bumps and so on. These tires are also 700cc like the previous bike. And another thing that's special about it, and you'll notice the frame is much sturdier. And you'll find that with e-bikes, factory-built e-bikes in particular, that their frames are beefed up. You can see the battery in the middle, and again we have the seat that's spring-loaded. And they went ahead and put the fenders on and everything, which we added on the other bike. But this is a pretty good performer, and it's a pretty good all-round bike. Probably most of you are going to be interested in a bike similar to this. This is a ladies' bike, as you can see by the frame cutout, but they also make a male version as well. And so you could choose whichever type or whatever fits you best. So this is the mountain bike. This is a bike I converted. I bought it brand new as a mountain bike and added the motor to it. Again, the tires is one of the major things you'll see, and you'll see how wide these tires are and how large the knobbies are, which works really well for digging into the ground and hill climbing in the rough. And so and the tires are 29-inch. They call them 29ers. They're about the largest size tire you'll find on a bike. So that really helps as well in rolling over. We also got the suspension forks in the front because you're hitting a lot more bumps, and they help cushion that and take the impact. It is a hardtail. You know, some of the modern mountain bikes will have shock absorption. I studied that and decided it wasn't worth the extra expense and the weight. So the tires are pretty wide and they add a lot of absorption, but I still have a seat that's cushioned to help again with the bumps and so on. Again, you'll notice the frame is much sturdier and much stronger. And that actually makes this a good conversion for an e-bike because you do already have the strong frame that'll handle the abuse and the extra speed and power that you have when you're running an e-bike. The other thing when you have a mountain bike is you generally want a larger motor. You've got a little heavier bike to pull along and you're dealing with rough terrain. You generally want a little more power to help you with that. I originally purchased this bike with and took it to CARVINS COVE, and I found it to be very strenuous and very difficult. So adding the motor has made a big difference for me in enjoying the hobby and enjoying the trails in CARVINS COVE. In this module, we're going to talk about the various type of electric motors that are used for e-bikes. The first model is a simple hub motor. I don't have a bike here that utilizes that type of motor, but you can see an example of it in the picture we're showing you now. The hub motor can be located either in the front or in the rear, and it's located in the center of the wheel. And you can, in all cases, with all these motors, you can purchase them in various sizes, and they refer to that as wattage. And there's a number of common sizes, and that's the 250 watt, the 350 watt, the 500 watt, the 750 watt, and the 1000 watt. That's the amount of power those motors are capable of putting out, and how much power they draw and how much power they can put out. Wattage is a pretty good indicator of that. The bigger the number, the more power the motor can put out, obviously. The reason why I don't have a hub motor here is because they're a direct drive motor. There's no gear ratio whatsoever. And when you live in an area with a lot of hills and mountains, that's not a really good choice. When you go uphill, the motor has no gear advantage at all, so it has to draw a lot of current to try to pull that bike up a hill. And so it's going to put extra stress on the batteries. There are advantages. It's a simpler motor, and on flat terrain, they work just fine. So, you know, they have their purpose. I just don't think they're necessarily the best choice for this area. The second type is a geared hub motor, and I believe that's a much better choice, and that's what I'm using here on this bike. The geared hub motor is located right here in the back. You can get geared hub motors for the front wheel too. There's some advantages to having it on the rear in that there's more weight on the rear tire, so it bites in a little better. And also it gives you a more natural ride because you're used to riding a bike where the rear wheel is the driven wheel. There's also a couple other things. If you're applying a lot of power and pedaling, there's times when you can almost raise the front tire on an e-bike. And so that's not a problem at all. As soon as you let up on the throttle, the tire comes down. On a front drive, if that tire starts to spin, if you give it a little too much power, it'll break traction. And when you break traction, you're going to lose control or risk losing control. You never want to apply too much brake or too much power to a front tire, just like in your car. So it's a little more stable having the motor in the rear. I've had really good luck with this. I've been riding this bike for 3 years now. The geared motor has worked out pretty well. I typically run it at a fairly low assist level, and then I use the throttle to add extra power when I need it, when I turn the start to go up a hill. All these motors are going to have a computer on them. And this computer is located in the center of the handlebars, and they'll allow you to set how much assist level you want. They'll also give you the odometer reading and how fast you're going. So these are very, very valuable and very useful. And this particular bike has 4 levels of assist. And as I mentioned, I usually run it on 1. The other thing, and this applies to both the simple hub motor and the gear hub motor, it applies power depending on what your level of assist is and whether or not you're pedaling. If you stop pedaling, it stops applying power. If you start pedaling, it senses that you're pedaling and it starts applying power. And it applies power to the level that you've set on the computer. If you want more power than that, either on the computer, and there's a little thumb control here, you can increase it, or you simply turn the throttle. As I say, what works out best for me, and I just set it at 1, the minimum amount of assistance, and then I just throttle on whenever I start going up a hill or I start off from a stop sign. Whenever I want that extra power to pick up speed, that's how I operate. It works out really well for me, but others might want to just run it in a higher level of assist. And the other thing I'll just mention is that when you start pedaling, it just turns on. So at level 1, it turns on and it's not a big deal. If you're on level 4 and you start pedaling, she turns on and it lurches forward because it's going to turn the power on at a pretty high assist level. And that can be a little a little scary if you're not prepared for that. So it is better, it's always best to start off at a lower setting and then increase once you get going. Or at least be aware that she's going to lurch forward so you're not caught off guard. So this bike uses a center drive motor. And the center drive motor is the more advanced type of motor. It's also a little bit more expensive. The center drive motor is located right in the center down here. And this again is a bike that I built myself, and this motor was added to it. And the battery is located right back here. This motor, being a center drive, is applying the power at the crank. So whatever gear you're in, that's the gear the motor is working with. And that's very advantageous. So if you're trying to climb a hill and you go down to your low gear, so you have the extra power pedaling to get up the hill, the motor also gets advantage from that. And so the motor can be much more efficient. So in general, a center drive draws less battery power for the same amount of power that it delivers because you're using the gear ratio to get exactly what you need. And that also benefits you as well. So as you shift for yourself, you're also shifting for the motor and giving it the best ratio as well. Another thing about the center drive is that it uses what they call a torque sensor. And the torque sensor is measuring how much pressure you're applying to the pedal. The more power you apply to the pedal, the more power the bike will give you. But the caveat is that's depending on how much assist you have it set at. This bike also has 4 levels of assist. And you choose which level you want. So if I'm on level 1, and I start pedaling hard, it gives me about 25% assist. If I'm at level 4 and I start pedaling hard, it'll give me full assist. And it'll more than double the amount of power that I have to bike up a hill. I've still got to work. And if I'm not putting pressure on that pedal, the bike is not going to apply power. So you've got to apply power yourself. You always got to exercise. But this multiplies your strength, depending on whether or not you're trying to go extra fast or you're trying to climb a hill. And so that's pretty desirable. That makes it feel like a normal bike, but yet you always have that extra power there available to you when and if you need it. And it comes on rather natural. If you push in on the pedal lightly, it applies a lighter amount of power, and when you push on it hard, it applies more power. So that works pretty well. That gives pretty good application of power. This bike does have a throttle, and it's a little thumb throttle over here. And I rarely use the throttle on this bike, almost never. For one thing, when you hit the throttle, the computer has to figure out that you no longer want pedal assist, and then it has to switch over to the manual throttle, and that cuts power for about 2 seconds. And that's just not desirable. And it really doesn't do anything for you because if you already have your power level up at 3 or 4 and you're pushing hard on the pedal, you're getting full power. The only thing the assist would help with, the thumb throttle would help with, is let's say you hurt your leg and you're having a hard time pedaling and putting pressure on the pedal. You theoretically could ride home on the thumb throttle. You'd still shift. You'd start off in a lower gear and then shift up as you come up in speed and use the thumb throttle, and you could limp home that way without having to pedal as much. So there is that advantage. Many bikes with the center drive do not have a throttle at all. And in many states, you're not allowed to have a throttle on an e-bike to ride on the trails. We don't have that limitation in Roanoke, and we're very fortunate in the Roanoke Valley that the city has allowed e-bikes on all their trails with no restrictions or minor restrictions. So that's very helpful. One other thing I want to mention, and that is that in all these bikes, because they have assist, you're going to find that you're going to be shifting less often. You don't have to be in exactly the right gear because in the case of the bike with the geared motor, it's always geared, and what gear you're in doesn't matter. That's only for you to make biking easier. And on the center drive motor, because you have the extra motor assist, even if you're geared a little too high, the electric motor helps adjust for that, and you can still pedal along. The other thing I'll say is that the shifting has more to do with your top end speed. If you're in a higher gear, you're going to be able to go a lot faster. A bike like this will pedal along at 25 miles an hour without too much effort. You'll have to work, but it's quite achievable, and you can ride that way for quite a while. I typically ride, though, at about 15 miles an hour. That's my normal gait on an e-bike, is about 15 miles an hour. Of course, I always slow way down whenever I'm coming near pedestrians, and we always have to remember that just because we can go fast, we always have to be careful when we're around pedestrians, and they have the right of way. And so I get real slow when I'm near pedestrians on the trails. And so, you know, to bike responsibly, you have to keep that in mind. So in this module, I want to talk to you about batteries. Batteries are extremely important, as you can imagine, with an electric bike. We talked a little bit about the motors and how they draw different amounts of wattage depending on how large the motor is. And the battery has to be matched up to that motor so that you have the power that you need, and also so that the battery lasts. To start with, we'll talk a little bit about the battery pack that came with this bike here. This one has a little key that's on the side that I can turn to release the battery, which is kind of handy. And it's got its own little charging module that we can plug in and to charge that battery up. What's kind of nice is that you can charge this battery up in your house, so you don't have to run power out to the bike. It's also nice to keep the battery in the house where it stays at room temperature. They perform a little better if they're not too cold or too hot. This battery has pretty good capacity. This is a 13 amp hour battery. That means that it can provide 13 amps for 1 hour. This bike uses a 250 watt motor. So I did a little calculating, which is easy to do with Ohm's law, and a 250 watt motor with a 36 volt battery pack draws 7 amps. And as we said, this is a 13 amp hour battery, so this thing will run this motor at full power for almost 2 hours. So that's really good range. Another battery pack I'm going to show you is this one. And this is a battery pack that I built myself. And I'm going to show you inside just so you have a little idea what that looks like. I bought the components and a battery management system, which is a circuit board. And here you can see all the 16650 cells that are used, 18650 cells that are used for this pack. These are the same kind of cells that you'll find in an automobile, an electric automobile, only lots more of them. And I bought these online, and they're connected in both parallel and serial to get to the voltage and the current that you need. This battery pack is a 8 amp hour battery pack at 48 volts. Because the voltage is higher, it has a higher energy level than what the current rating might indicate. And so typically for my mountain bike that I use this pack on, I get about a 40 or 50 mile range. My wife gets about a 60 mile range on this bike with the 13 amp hour at 36 volts. Being a lower voltage, the range isn't quite as good. And on the urban bike that I showed you earlier that I built, that battery is 36 volts also, and it's only 6 amp hour. So I get about a 30 mile range, a 30, maybe 35 mile range. But I find that to be okay for around town. I just plug it in the charger when I get home. Where my wife only charges her battery maybe once every couple of weeks, or depending on how much she rides. I ride a lot more than she does. I put it on the charger every night so it's fresh when I go on my next ride, because the capacity is lower. So that's another thing. You don't have to worry if the battery capacity is not as high if you don't mind charging it and you're not going for really long rides. So, you know, those are a few factors. And also I should mention, the larger the capacity of the battery, the more expensive it's going to be. So, and the heavier it's going to be. So you don't need to go real huge on a battery pack unless you want to go on some really long rides. Also, if the battery starts to run lower, pedal harder. That's the really nice thing about having an e-bike, is it's a hybrid bike in the way that you can pedal to offset any of your power needs. And so, you know, you can always start pedaling and, you know, not use as much of your battery power. In this module, we're going to talk about brakes. The first type is a caliper brake. The caliper brake is a type of brake that this bike originally came with, and it's the kind of brake that you'd be used to with your old 10-speed bikes back in the day. They were good, but they make better brakes now. I don't have a bike here with caliper brakes, but in the picture you can see what they look like. Now this bike, I bought a new kit, and I replaced the caliper brake with these V-brakes. And the thing that's really nice about the V-brakes is that they have a lot more, you can apply a lot more force because they got larger levers. And they also have larger brake shoes, so they can apply more pressure. When you're working on an e-bike and you're probably going to be riding a little faster and you have a little more weight, you want a little better brake. You're only as safe as the brakes that can stop you. And of course, these are all rim brakes. And rim brakes have their downsides. If the rim gets wet or muddy or dirty, your brakes have to stop the bike through that dirt that's on the rim. And that rim is in pretty close proximity to the tires. So that's the downside of rim brakes. But besides that, they work pretty well. And I have pretty good performance with these brakes after converting them to V-brakes. So that's not a bad option. I wouldn't not buy a bike because it has V-brakes, but there is a better brake available out there, and I'm going to show you that brake to you next. So this is the disc brake, and the disc brake is the best. The disc brake is what's used in your automobile. You can see the disc right here, and here you have the calipers that squeeze that disc. The disc is away from the tires, so it's more likely to stay dry and you're not going to get mud and dirt on it. So disc brakes tend to last longer before you need to replace the pads. This particular bike has hydraulic disc brakes, just like your automobile. We have discs on the front and the rear. You can also get cable-driven disc brakes. They're not quite as good, but they're still good, and they're still better than V-brakes. What's really nice about the hydraulic brakes is how smooth the brake action is. The brakes come on very gradually and they get very strong. And that's always worth mentioning. Everybody needs to know this who rides a bike, whether it's an e-bike or a regular bike, is that the front brake has the most stopping power and the rear brake is the safest to use. And what I mean is that if you lock up your rear tire, it's not going to wipe you out. If you lock up your front tire, you're going to go over the handlebars and you're almost certainly going to wipe out. And so the trick is to always apply the rear brake first and then apply the front brake as you need it to come to a stop. And that way you'll always be able to maintain control over your bicycle. So rear brake first, and then apply front brake to go along with it to bring you to a complete stop. The rear brake is almost always going to be on your right hand, and your right hand is the strongest. So as you pull tight on your right hand to apply that rear brake, and then you start to apply your left hand on the front brake to come to a complete stop. That's the safest. And another thing you always have to be aware of, if you're trying to stop quickly and you're coming to a turn and you start to turn, If you're applying too much front brake, it's going to be very hard for that bicycle to turn. And I've seen, and it's happened to me, if you hit a curve, a lip at the curving, the bike will tip over. That front brake, apply too hard on the front tire, if it hits an irregular surface on the road, it'll want to dump you. So always be careful about using that front brake. Use it with the rear brake, and don't over apply it if you're turning, because it'll cause you to lose control. That's also the case in gravel. If you're in gravel and you apply too much front brake, you're going to lose your steering ability on that front tire, and that's not a good thing. The other bike I showed you, the mountain bike, that also has hydraulic disc brakes. And that's extremely useful when you're on mountain trails where the tires tend to get muddy and wet all the time. Disc brakes are really the way to go.